Hi, during this video I'll be explaining some of the key differences between the GB transmission system and the French transmission system. If we take a look at the GB transmission system, we see around 7,000 miles of overhead line and 900 miles of cable network. If we compare this to the French transmission system, we see 48,000 miles of overhead line but only 2,000 miles of cable network. This shows that there's a much higher density of cable network on the GB system to the French system. On the GB network, primarily the cable networks are found surrounding the major demand centres associated with 275 kV voltages. We see this in Sheffield and London with a lot of cable networks. If we look at the French transmission system, we still see these 275 meshed networks around the major demand centres, but we see a much greater density of AC interconnection between Europe. I believe this is the reason that we see much more overhead line in France than we do on the GB system, where there's no AC interconnection between Europe. In France, there are over 60 cross-boundary circuits between France and the rest of mainland Europe. There are DC links between France and Spain, France and England, and one under construction between France and Italy. On the GB system, we're dependent on interconnection between Europe via DC links. These DC links provide no inertia response or any voltage benefits as seen from AC interconnection. And this is reflected when we look at the frequency deviations. If we look at a frequency trace on the GB transmission system, we see much more deviation from 50 than what we would on the French GB transmission network, where it's much closer to 50 with fewer deviations. The result of this is for plant loss on the GB system, we see the frequency drop significantly more so than what we would do on the French system. To negate this, the GB transmission system operator holds response and reserve, and this is sufficient to cover the largest system loss. However, there are significant costs associated with this and often requires synchronising plant to cover it. If we look on the French system, the high interconnection between mainland Europe and the high volume of nuclear generation means that the levels of inertia within the transmission system are significantly higher and the impact of plant loss is significantly reduced. France is also a net exporter of electricity. In fact, in Europe is the highest exporter out of all countries. We see the generation and demand on the transmission system in France largely increasing. Compare this to the GB transmission system, where since 2007 both generation and demand has been declining. This could be partly apportioned to the fact that the transmission voltages in France are right down to 63 kV. Therefore, much of the generation now connecting on the GB transmission system is what we would refer to embedded, i.e. connects either into the distribution network, and therefore the demands and therefore the generation is not necessarily seen by the transmission system operator, but is seen as an offset in demand. At 63 kV on the French transmission network, much of this generation will be transmission connected, and we see this by the result of solar and wind connected into the transmission network on the French system. Therefore, the demands are more true and are not offset by the embedded generation as seen on the GB system. It's worth mentioning that if we look at the south of France, especially around the Swiss and Italian borders, we see lots of hydro and pump storage stations. In England we do have hydro and pump storage stations, namely Crewcombe, Foyers, Glendow, Festiniog and De Norwich, but we're limited by the mountainous terrain that Great Britain offers. In France with the Pyrenees and the Alps, there is significant opportunity for pump and hydro storage, and this helps the French system operator in managing their reserve and response, and therefore ultimately would reduce the cost in operating the transmission system. In the UK we commonly see plant being curtailed or plants brought on due to the largest loss, rock-off issues or for voltage management. With the availability of 70% of their generation mix of nuclear, synchronous machines and much more hydro stations, This would be far less common on the French transmission network.